Lyra sat in the corner of the shuttle, her hands resting gently on her stomach. The quiet hum of the engines filled the space. She kept her eyes on the floor, unwilling to look at the two guards who sat across from her. Their faces showed no emotion. To them, this was only duty. To her, it was the end of everything she had known. She was not a criminal. She had harmed no one. Yet, her people had laws that left no room for mistakes. Pregnancy was only accepted during certain cycles, approved and timed by the council. Lyra had broken that order. The life within her had come later than permitted. For that, she was judged unfit to remain among her kind. The shuttle rattled as it broke through the thin clouds of her home world. She looked out one last time through the small window. The blue surface of the planet faded behind her, shrinking until it was only a round shape in the dark sky. A place she had loved since childhood now turned its back on her. She pressed her lips together, refusing to let her sadness show in front of the guards. Hours later, the shuttle approached a silent station that floated near the edge of the system. The structure looked old, its outer walls marked by years of neglect. It was no place to live. It was a place to be forgotten. The guards guided Lyra out of the shuttle without speaking. One carried a small container of supplies, the only gift her people had left her. Inside were ration packs, a blanket, and a few tools. No more, no less. They placed it near the entrance and turned back toward their ship. Lyra stood alone as the shuttle detached and drifted away. The engines lit up, and in seconds it was gone, leaving her in the silent shadow of the abandoned station. She wrapped her arms around herself and took a slow breath. This was her new home. The door hissed shut behind her as she stepped inside. The air was cold, smelling faintly of metal and dust. The corridors were dim, lit by strips of light that flickered every few steps. She walked slowly, her hand brushing the wall for balance. Her body was not heavy yet, but she could feel the weight of the child inside her. It was a reminder of why she was here. Room after room lay empty. Some were filled with broken furniture. Others had old consoles that no longer worked. The silence pressed on her ears. There was no sound of voices, no sign of life. Only the soft hum of machines that still managed to run. She found a small chamber with a wide window overlooking the stars. The seat by the window was dusty, but it was the only place that felt less like a cage. She sat down and pulled the blanket from the container. Wrapping it around her shoulders, she gazed at the endless stretch of space. Her thoughts drifted back to the council chamber where her fate had been decided. She remembered standing alone in the center as voices rose around her. They spoke of tradition, of order, of balance. Not once did anyone speak of her child's right to live. Not once did anyone ask how she felt. She had wanted to cry out, but her voice had stayed trapped in her throat. When the judgment was announced, she had lowered her head in silence. Now, in the emptiness of the station, her silence weighed even heavier. She whispered softly to the child within her. "You are not unwanted. You are not a mistake. You are mine, and I will protect you." Her words echoed in the room, bouncing off the metal walls, as if the station itself was listening. Days passed slowly. She explored more of the station, marking which rooms had working power and which did not. The food rations were plain but enough to keep her alive. She rationed them carefully, always thinking of the time ahead. Her people might never return. She had to plan as if no one would come. The hardest part was the loneliness. She had grown up surrounded by voices, music, and gatherings. Here there was nothing. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine the laughter of her friends, the smell of her home's gardens, the soft touch of her mother's hand. But when she opened her eyes, all that remained was the cold emptiness of metal walls. Still, she refused to give up. Each day she rose and walked the station's long halls to keep her strength. She spoke to her unborn child as if they were walking together. She told stories of her home, of the rivers and the skies, of the markets filled with colors and sounds. She wanted the child to know these things, even if they would never see them. One evening, as she sat by the window, she saw the faint glow of her world far away. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it quickly. The exile had taken her people, her future, and her name in the eyes of her kind. But it could not take her will. "This is not the end," she whispered. "This is the beginning." Her voice was soft, but in the silence it carried. The child shifted within her, and she felt a spark of warmth. For the first time since she was cast away, hope stirred in her heart. The station might have been built for abandonment, but she decided she would not let it claim her spirit. She would survive here. She would raise her child here. She would find a way to turn exile into life. The stars outside the window shone like distant fires, and Lyra kept her eyes on them. Somewhere out there, beyond her loneliness, was a future waiting to be claimed. The days blended together as Lyra explored the forgotten station. Every corridor looked the same at first glance, long, narrow, and dimly lit by flickering panels, but she forced herself to learn each turn and passage. The station was large, once built to hold many, yet now it was only hers. Each step echoed, making her feel as if the walls themselves were listening to her movements. She carried a small piece of chalk she had found in a broken storage locker. With it, she marked the walls as she moved, leaving simple symbols so she would not lose her way. One symbol meant the corridor led to working power. Another meant broken systems. A circle meant safe resting places. These marks became her map, a language between her and the silent station. The food rations were stored in sealed packs. They were tasteless, but she reminded herself that survival was more important than flavor. She ate slowly, never more than she needed. She drank from the old water filters, which still worked after so many years. She whispered thanks to the unknown hands that had built the machines. They had left her something she could depend on. The emptiness was hardest during the long nights. There was no sunrise here, no sound of morning bells, no voices to greet her. The station followed a cycle of light and dark, but it felt hollow, a clock without meaning. Sometimes, in the dark hours, she would sit by the wide window and imagine she was not alone. She would imagine another voice answering her when she spoke. One night she heard a sound in the corridor. It was faint, like metal shifting, and her heart raced. She stood still, listening. The sound came again. For a moment she thought someone had come, that the guards had returned, or that another exile had been sent here. She hurried toward the noise, her bare feet light against the floor. But when she reached the corridor, it was empty. A loose pipe had dropped from the ceiling, rolling against the wall. She bent to pick it up and let out a shaky laugh. Even the smallest sound could stir her hope. She carried the pipe back with her, deciding it could be used as a tool if needed. Her body grew heavier with each passing week. The child was growing quickly, and she felt the strain in her back and legs. Still, she forced herself to walk each day. The station was not kind to stillness. Dust gathered fast, and the air felt heavier if she stayed too long in one place. Moving gave her strength, and strength gave her courage. Sometimes she would talk aloud to the station. She would thank it when the power panels flickered to life. She would scold it when doors refused to open. She would laugh at her own words when she realized she was treating the station like an old companion. In truth, it was easier than speaking only to herself. One afternoon she discovered a storage room filled with old containers. Most were empty, but one held blankets folded tightly. They were thin and worn, yet they smelled faintly of fabric rather than dust. She carried them back to her chamber by the window and made a small nest. For the first time, she felt a little warmth when she lay down. She dreamed often of her home. In dreams she walked through the gardens, touching the leaves that glowed faintly in the night. She heard her mother's voice calling her name. But always, just as she turned to answer, she woke in the cold silence of the station. Each morning, she told herself not to cry. Tears would not help her child. Strength would. The station had a central hall where great gatherings must once have been held. Lyra found it on her third week of exploring. The hall was wide, with a broken screen covering one wall. Rows of seats circled the space. Dust lay thick, but she could almost hear the echoes of voices that had once filled it. She walked to the center and stood still, imagining the crowd that had never known her. For a brief moment she pretended the hall was filled again, not with strangers, but with friends. She imagined their voices lifting her, reminding her she was not forgotten. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the silence returned. She walked back to her chamber, holding her stomach for comfort. The child moved often now. She would stop her work to place both hands on her belly, smiling despite the ache in her body. The life within her was strong. That strength gave her purpose. She was no longer surviving only for herself. She was preparing a place for someone who would depend entirely on her. One day she decided to repair one of the smaller rooms. She swept away the dust with a cloth, patched a crack in the wall with pieces of metal she had collected, and set up a blanket on the floor. She told herself it would be the child's room. Even if the child would not need it for many months, the act of preparing filled her with energy. It was no longer just a station. It was slowly becoming a home. Yet fear still lived in her heart. Sometimes she would wonder what would happen if the machines failed, if the power ran out, if her rations ended. She would sit by the window, watching the stars, and feel as if the universe itself pressed against her chest. But then she would whisper softly to her child, promising she would never give up. The stars outside never changed, yet to Lyra they became her companions. She learned to recognize the brighter ones, giving them names in her own tongue. One she called Guide, for it seemed to point her back to her world. Another she called Hope, because it shone brighter than the rest. When fear threatened her, she looked at those stars and felt steadier. The station remained silent, but Lyra was no longer only a prisoner of exile. She was a mother preparing for the future. The empty halls echoed with her footsteps, her words, and her plans. She knew she was still alone, but she also knew she was not broken. The station was empty, yes, but she was filling it with meaning. For herself. For her child. For whatever was to come. And deep within her heart, though she could not explain why, she felt that her time of complete loneliness would not last forever. Lyra woke to the sound of metal striking metal. At first she thought it was only the station settling again, but then she heard a different sound, a deep hum, steady and powerful. Her eyes flew open. She knew that sound. It was not the hum of the old machines around her. It was the sound of an engine. She sat up quickly, her blanket falling from her shoulders. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. Someone was approaching. For a moment, her heart filled with hope, but then fear followed. What if it was her people, returning not to help her, but to punish her further? What if they had changed their minds and wanted her gone forever? She pressed her hand against her stomach. The child shifted as if sensing her fear. Lyra whispered, "Stay calm. I will protect you." Her voice shook, but she forced her body to move. Slowly, she made her way toward the docking bay. The air vibrated as a small vessel connected with the station. She stood in the shadows of the corridor, watching as the hatch hissed open. For several long breaths, nothing happened. Then a figure stepped inside. It was not one of her people. The figure was taller, broader, wearing a heavy suit with a clear visor. Through the glass she saw a face unlike her own, with rough skin and dark eyes scanning the corridor. He carried a light in his hand, shining it along the walls as if searching for signs of life. Lyra's heart raced. She had heard of humans before, but never seen one. Her people spoke of them as unpredictable, too curious for their own safety, but also stubborn survivors. What was a human doing here, on this forgotten station? The man moved carefully, his steps slow. He muttered to himself in a language she only partly understood. His voice echoed through the metal halls, filling the silence she had lived in for so long. Lyra remained hidden, unsure if she should reveal herself. Yet the child within her shifted again, and she felt the ache of her loneliness more than ever. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I cannot stay silent." She stepped forward. The man stopped instantly, his light turning toward her. The beam struck her eyes, and she lifted a hand to shield her face. For a moment neither moved. The silence stretched, heavy and sharp. Then the man lowered the light slightly, enough that she could see his expression. His brows were raised in surprise, not anger. His eyes widened as he took in her thin frame, her rounded stomach, her weary face. He spoke again, his words slow this time, careful. She caught only a few of them. "You, here, alone." Lyra nodded, though she was not sure he would understand. Her voice came softly, her own language mixed with simple words she hoped he might know. "Exile. Alone. Child." The man's face changed. The surprise in his eyes softened into something else, concern. He took a cautious step closer, then stopped, as if not wanting to frighten her. He pointed to himself. "Daniel," he said clearly. The sound was strange to her ears, but she understood it was his name. She placed a hand over her chest. "Lyra." For the first time in many weeks, she spoke her name aloud to another being. It felt both fragile and strong. Daniel's eyes flickered around the corridor, taking in the broken lights and dust. He frowned and then gestured back toward his vessel, but Lyra shook her head firmly. She pointed to her stomach, then to the station, trying to show him she could not leave so easily. He seemed to understand. He nodded slowly, then set down a bag he carried. Opening it, he pulled out a small container and offered it to her. Inside were food packs, different from her own. She hesitated, then accepted one. The taste was strange, but it was fresh, unlike the stale rations she had been eating. She whispered, "Thank you." Daniel watched her carefully, as if studying her every move. He did not push closer. Instead, he sat on a piece of fallen metal a short distance away, removing his helmet. His hair was short and his face rough, but his eyes were calm. He began speaking again, his words gentle, his hands moving to help explain what he meant. Lyra listened carefully, catching pieces of his meaning. He told her he had come to the station searching for parts and supplies. He had not expected anyone to be here. Lyra nodded and pointed around the hall. Empty. Long time. Daniel's gaze softened again. She saw in his face not judgment, but quiet sympathy. He did not ask why she was here. Perhaps he knew it was not his place. Instead, he lifted another pack from his bag and pushed it toward her. They sat together in silence for a while, the sound of the station humming around them. For the first time since her exile, Lyra did not feel completely alone. Later, he rose and gestured for her to follow. She hesitated but decided to trust him. They walked through the corridors, his light guiding the way. When they reached the central hall, Daniel stopped and stared at the broken screens, the dust, the emptiness. He shook his head as if saddened by what he saw. Lyra pointed to the stars visible through a small window. "My world," she said softly. Daniel followed her gaze, then looked back at her. His eyes seemed to say, "I understand." That night, when she returned to her chamber, she sat by the window as always. But this time, she was not speaking only to her child. She spoke the name Daniel aloud, testing its sound on her tongue. It felt strange, but also comforting. The emptiness of the station had been broken. A new presence had entered her world, unexpected and unfamiliar, yet strangely welcome. As she wrapped herself in her blanket, Lyra felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in many weeks. She felt the faint stirrings of hope, not born from the stars this time, but from the quiet kindness of a human who had stepped into her exile. The next morning, Lyra woke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. For a moment she thought she had dreamed of Daniel, that his arrival had only been her mind's way of fighting loneliness. But when she stepped out of her chamber, she saw him in the hall, carrying a box of tools from his ship. He turned when he heard her, gave a small nod, and smiled in his quiet way. It was not a wide smile, not loud or forceful, but it was warm. Lyra felt her heart ease at the sight. He was still here. Daniel placed the box down and began working on a panel that had long been broken. Sparks flashed as he tested the circuits. Lyra tilted her head, curious. She had walked past that panel many times, never knowing how to repair it. She stepped closer and asked softly, "Fix?" Daniel glanced at her, nodded, and replied, "Yes." "Fix." "Power." He tapped the wall with his hand and then pointed to the lights above. Understanding came slowly, but Lyra smiled. He was trying to give the station more light. She sat nearby, watching him work. The human was skilled. His hands moved with steady confidence, not rushing, not careless. Every few moments he explained something in his own language, mixing words with gestures. Lyra did not know most of his words, but she began to understand through his motions. When the panel sparked brightly, Daniel muttered something that sounded like disappointment. Lyra laughed softly, and to her surprise he laughed as well. For a brief moment the station echoed with a sound it had not heard in many years' shared laughter. Later, Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out two simple objects. One was a small piece of metal. The other was a small light. He held up the metal and said clearly, "Metal." He waited, pointing again. Lyra frowned for a moment, then repeated, "Metal." Her voice was unsure, but Daniel nodded with approval. Then he lifted the light. "Light." She tried again. "Light." Daniel smiled. He pointed at her stomach, then himself, then spoke slowly, "Learn. Together." Lyra's chest warmed. He wanted to teach her. He wanted to learn with her. She placed a hand on her chest and nodded. "Learn. Together." From that day on, their time was not only about survival. It was about building a bridge between their worlds. Every day Daniel would teach her simple words in his language. He would point to objects and repeat the word until she understood. She, in turn, shared her own words. He struggled at first, but his effort never stopped. "Water," Daniel would say, holding a flask. "Nail," Lyra would reply, giving him the word from her own tongue. They repeated the sounds back and forth, sometimes laughing when the other stumbled. The laughter lightened the heavy air of the station. Together they repaired what they could. Daniel showed her how to connect wires, how to replace small circuits with spares from his ship. Lyra guided him through the old halls, showing which rooms still had power and which were safe to use. What had once been endless silence now became a rhythm of work, talk, and learning. At night they would sit in the central hall. Daniel often spoke of his journeys, though Lyra only caught pieces of his meaning. Still, she could see the stories in his face, in the way his eyes moved when he spoke of stars and distant places. She wished she could tell him more of her own life, but her words were too few. Instead, she shared small stories with gestures, painting shapes in the air with her hands. One evening, as they sat by the wide window, Lyra spoke softly. "Exile." She touched her stomach. "Law. Wrong time." Daniel listened. His brows drew together as he tried to understand. Slowly, she added more. She drew a circle in the air to mean her world, then crossed it out with her hand. She pressed a hand to her stomach again, then placed both hands on her chest as if to say, "I wanted this." Daniel's eyes softened. He nodded slowly, not with pity but with respect. He did not look away, did not turn his face in judgment. Instead, he simply said her name, Lyra, as if to remind her that she was still a person, not only an exile. The next day Daniel surprised her with a gift. From his ship, he had taken a small tool and shaped it into a charm. It was rough, just a small star made of metal, but he tied it to a thin string and placed it in her hand. "For you," he said. Lyra stared at the object. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She had not received a gift since before the council had judged her. She placed the charm around her neck and whispered, "Thank you." Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. They did not need many words to understand one another anymore. A gesture, a look, a small smile carried more than whole sentences. The station itself began to change with their efforts. Lights flickered back to life in the halls they repaired. Small areas became warmer, safer, more alive. The emptiness was no longer complete. Where once there had been silence, now there were footsteps, voices, and laughter. Still, Lyra worried about the future. She knew her child would come soon, and fear often whispered in her mind. Would she be strong enough? Would she have what the child needed? But whenever she looked at Daniel, she felt calmer. His steady presence reminded her that she was not truly alone anymore. One evening, as they finished repairing a water system, Daniel stood and looked around the hall. He wiped his brow and then smiled. "Better," he said. Lyra nodded, placing a hand on her stomach. "Better." For the first time since her exile, she believed those words fully. The station was no longer just a cage of metal. It had become a place of learning, a place where two strangers from different worlds slowly built trust. And in that trust, Lyra found a strength she had thought was lost. The days passed more quickly now. Where once the station had been nothing but silence, it was now filled with movement and sound. Daniel worked on broken machines, and Lyra walked beside him, guiding him to places she had already explored. Together they created a rhythm, a steady pattern that made each day feel less empty. Lyra found herself looking forward to his footsteps echoing in the corridors. She no longer felt fear when she heard noise in the distance. Instead, she felt relief, knowing it was him. His presence had changed everything. One morning Daniel brought a bundle of wires and sat in the central hall, spreading them across the dusty floor. He tried to explain his plan using words and gestures. Lyra leaned forward, watching carefully as he shaped the wires into patterns. She did not understand every detail, but she could see the excitement in his eyes. He wanted to bring more light and power to the station. "Better," he said firmly, tapping the wires. "Better," Lyra repeated with a small smile. They worked side by side for hours, their hands sometimes brushing as they passed tools. Lyra noticed how patient he was. When she struggled to understand, he slowed down, never showing anger. When she made mistakes, he corrected them with gentle guidance. His steady nature calmed her, and she realized she was beginning to trust him more than she had trusted anyone in a very long time. At night, after the repairs were done, they would share food from Daniel's supplies. His food was richer than her plain rations, and he always made sure she ate enough before he did. She noticed how he often glanced at her stomach, not with judgment, but with quiet concern. She would rest her hand there, and he would give a small nod as if to say, "You are not alone in this." One evening, as they sat near the window, Lyra told him another piece of her story. Using simple words and slow speech, she explained that her people had laws that did not forgive. "Child, too late," she said, pressing her hand to her belly. "Counsel, no accept." Daniel listened silently. His face was serious, his eyes dark with thought. When she finished, he shook his head firmly. "Wrong," he said, his voice low but strong. "You, good. Child, good." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Lyra felt tears rise in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. She had been judged so harshly by her own people, yet here was a human, a stranger, who told her she was good. She looked at him with gratitude she could not fully express. The trust between them grew in small ways. Daniel showed her how to use his tools without fear of breaking them. She taught him which corridors were safe and which doors were best left closed. When she grew tired from walking, he slowed his pace without being asked. When he cut his hand on a sharp piece of metal, she tore a strip from her old blanket to wrap the wound. Their words were still limited, but their actions spoke clearly. Each day they proved to one another that they were no longer strangers. Lyra began to dream differently now. In her dreams, she no longer walked alone through empty gardens. Instead, she saw Daniel walking beside her, the child in her arms. She woke with a sense of peace she had not known before. One afternoon, as they worked in the central hall, the lights above suddenly flickered and then glowed brighter than before. Daniel stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, and gave a loud laugh. Lyra clapped her hands together in delight. The hall was brighter, warmer, almost alive again. She turned to him and said clearly, "You make strong." Daniel shook his head and pointed to both of them. "We make strong." The words settled in her heart. It was true. Alone, She had only survived. Together, they were building something new. That evening, Daniel surprised her again. From his ship he brought a small screen that still worked. He connected it to a power source and showed her images from his journeys. Lyra leaned close, her eyes wide as she saw pictures of blue oceans, green forests, and bright cities filled with light. She had never seen such places. "Human world," Daniel said, pointing to one of the images. Lyra touched the screen gently, almost afraid it would vanish. "Beautiful," she whispered. Daniel watched her face, and for a moment his expression softened even more. He seemed glad to share these things with her. She realized then that trust was not only about safety. It was also about sharing pieces of oneself. As days turned into weeks, the station no longer felt like a prison. It began to feel like a place of possibility. The halls were still old and broken, but they were also filled with hope. Lyra often caught herself smiling without reason. She smiled when Daniel fixed a panel, when he spoke a new word in her language, when he offered her food before taking any for himself. She smiled because the weight of loneliness had lifted. Daniel, too, seemed to change. At first he had moved with the careful distance of a stranger. Now he laughed more often, spoke with more ease, and sometimes sat quietly beside her without needing to fill the silence. They had found comfort in simply being near each other. One night, as they rested in the central hall, Lyra whispered, "Thank you." Daniel tilted his head, not fully understanding. She touched her chest, then pointed to him. "Thank you. You stay." His eyes softened, and he gave a slow nod. "Stay," he repeated. Those simple words filled her with peace. She no longer feared being abandoned again. She knew now that Daniel would not leave her until she was safe. Their trust was not built on grand promises or complex words. It was built on small acts of kindness, steady presence, and shared effort. In a station that had once been empty and lifeless, two very different beings had found something rare. They had found trust. The station had grown warmer and brighter since Daniel's arrival, but as the days passed, a new tension filled the air. Lyra's body grew heavier, her steps slower, and the time she had been waiting for was drawing near. The child within her moved often, pressing against her from the inside. She whispered soothing words, though her own heart carried both fear and hope. Daniel noticed the change. He watched her carefully each day, making sure she did not work too hard. When she tried to lift a tool or walk too far, he gently stopped her with a raised hand. "Rest," he would say firmly. At first Lyra resisted, not wanting to feel weak, but she soon understood his concern. She began to rest more often, letting him take over the harder tasks. The station, once only a place of survival, had now become a waiting place. Every sound seemed sharper to Lyra, every moment longer. She wondered if she would have the strength when the time came. She had never been alone for such a task. Yet she was not truly alone anymore. She had Daniel. One night the pain began. It was deep and sharp, unlike anything she had felt before. She clutched her stomach and leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Daniel, who had been nearby repairing a small console, rushed to her side. His eyes widened with understanding. "Now," he asked, his voice steady but urgent. Lyra nodded, unable to form more words. She sank to the floor, her body trembling. Daniel quickly cleared space, moving tools and blankets to make a safe place for her to lie down. He spread the softest blanket he had found earlier and helped her settle onto it. The hours that followed felt endless. The station's hum faded into the background as Lyra focused only on the rhythm of pain and breath. Daniel stayed beside her the entire time. He spoke in his calm, steady voice, though she understood only fragments of his words. Still, the tone was enough. His presence was a wall against fear. Whenever she faltered, he took her hand in his, guiding her through the waves of pain. His grip was firm, grounding her, reminding her that she was not fighting alone. At times she cried out, her voice echoing through the empty hall, but Daniel never left her side. He wiped the sweat from her brow, gave her water when she could drink, and whispered her name as if the sound itself was a promise. The hours stretched, and Lyra's strength weakened. She felt as if the station itself held its breath with her. Her body shook, and she feared she could not continue. But then Daniel leaned close, his eyes steady on hers, and said one simple word she understood clearly. Strong. That word lit something inside her. She closed her eyes and gathered the last of her strength. With one final cry, the child came into the world. The sharp cry of new life filled the chamber, piercing the silence of the station in a way no sound ever had. Lyra collapsed back against the blanket, tears streaming down her face. Daniel carefully lifted the small, wriggling child, wrapping it in the cloth he had prepared. He looked at the newborn with awe, his rough hands gentle as he held the fragile life. Then he placed the child into Lyra's arms. Lyra gazed down at the tiny face, her breath catching in her throat. The child's skin was soft, the eyes tightly closed, the cries loud and full of life. She touched the small hand, and the baby's fingers curled around hers. In that moment, the weight of exile, the loneliness, the fear, all of it melted away. She whispered, "Mine." Daniel sat beside her, watching with quiet reverence. His face was tired, lined with concern and relief, but his eyes shone with pride as if he had been part of something sacred. Lyra looked up at him and spoke softly, "Together." He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between her and the child. "Together," he repeated. The station seemed different now. It was no longer only a place of survival or even of trust. It had become the birthplace of something new. The cries of the child filled the metal walls with life, echoing like a promise that the future was no longer empty. The following hours were filled with care. Daniel brought water and food, making sure Lyra regained her strength. He moved quietly, always checking on the child, always ready to help. Lyra, though weak, felt stronger in her heart than she ever had. She held the baby close, feeling its warmth against her chest. She whispered stories to the child, the same ones she had spoken to her belly in the long months of exile. But now she had a real listener, small and breathing, with tiny fingers that clung to her. She told the baby of the rivers on her world, of the gardens filled with colors, of the stars that had been her only companions. She promised that this child would see more than exile. Daniel often sat beside her during these moments, his presence quiet but steady. Sometimes he would smile at the baby, his eyes soft, his voice gentle as he spoke words Lyra could not always understand. But she knew the meaning. She knew he was offering comfort, offering his strength not only to her but also to the newborn life. Days passed, and the child grew stronger. Its cries were loud, its movements small but determined. Lyra watched Daniel hold the baby once, carefully supporting its tiny head. He looked awkward, as if afraid to break something so delicate, but his face showed wonder. Lyra laughed softly, and Daniel glanced at her with a smile that spoke more than words. The bond between them deepened in those days. They had shared labor, pain, and the miracle of new life. Trust had turned into something greater, something that felt like family. Lyra often thought back to the day she had been cast out. She remembered the cold eyes of the council, the harshness of their judgment. They had sent her to be forgotten. Yet here she was, holding a child born in exile, with a human by her side who had given her strength when she needed it most. The station, once abandoned, had become the beginning of a new story. As Lyra rocked the baby to sleep one evening, she looked out the window at the endless stars. Her voice was soft but filled with resolve. "You are not alone. We are not alone." Daniel sat nearby, listening. He nodded, as if agreeing with every word. And in that quiet chamber, surrounded by the hum of the old machines and the light of distant stars, 3 lives were bound together. Exile had tried to take everything from her, but in the moment of birth, she had found hope, strength, and a future she had never expected. The days after the birth were filled with quiet routines, but the station felt alive in a way it never had before. Lyra and Daniel moved together, caring for the child, repairing the old systems, and learning to live as a small family in the vast emptiness of space. Each day brought new tasks, new lessons, and new hope. Lyra watched the child sleep in her arms, small fingers curling against her chest. Every breath seemed miraculous, every tiny movement a reminder of life's persistence. She traced the child's features with her eyes, marveling at the soft skin, the small nose, and the delicate mouth. It was hard to believe such a fragile being could hold so much power to change hearts. Daniel brought her a cup of warm water and sat beside her. His presence was steady and reassuring. He did not speak much, but his hands were always ready to help, his eyes always alert to any need. Lyra smiled softly at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, his face quiet but kind. "Always," he said simply. Together, they continued the work of making the station more comfortable. Daniel repaired the lights in the halls, replaced worn circuits, and made sure the life support systems ran smoothly. Lyra, despite her lingering weakness, organized the small supplies, cleaned the areas where they lived, and prepared food for the 3 of them. Each task felt meaningful now. They were not simply surviving, they were creating a home. One afternoon, as Lyra sat by the window holding the child, Daniel entered carrying a small object he had found in his ship. It was a tiny star-shaped charm, polished and bright. He handed it to her with a smile. Lyra took it, examining it carefully, then hung it above the child's sleeping area. "This is for the future," Daniel said. Lyra nodded, feeling warmth spread through her chest. The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. The child now had a symbol of hope, a promise that life would continue, that kindness could exist even in the most forgotten places. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra began to teach the child words from her language. Even in its earliest days, the child responded to her voice, cooing and stretching when she spoke. Daniel joined, teaching a few human words. The mixture of languages in the small chamber became a song of 2 worlds blending together. The station, once silent and cold, now resonated with laughter and tiny cries. Lyra often paused to watch Daniel interact with the child. He had a gentle patience that amazed her. When the baby reached for him, he bent carefully, letting the small fingers touch his hands. When the child cried, he would rock it slightly, speaking softly in a language that made Lyra smile. It was in these small moments that Lyra realized how much she had changed. She had gone from being an exile, abandoned and alone, to a mother surrounded by love and support. She had learned that life could continue even in the harshest conditions, and that trust, once given, could create something stronger than fear. One evening, as they all sat together near the window, Lyra looked out at the distant stars. She remembered the day she had first arrived at the station, cold and frightened. At that time, the stars had been indifferent witnesses to her exile. Now, they felt different. They seemed to shine with possibility, guiding her toward a new life. Daniel leaned closer, his arm brushing hers. Lyra glanced at him and smiled. No words were necessary. They had built their understanding through action, through shared care, and through the quiet moments of survival. The child stirred in her arms, stretching and making small noises. Lyra held it closer, whispering softly in both her language and Daniel's. The mixture of words seemed to calm the little one, and Daniel watched with awe. The bond between mother, child, and human companion was growing stronger every day. Lyra began to make plans for the future. The station, though repaired in parts, was not a place to remain forever. She and Daniel discussed building a small shuttle from parts he had brought, so they could leave the station when the child was strong enough. For the first time since her exile, Lyra allowed herself to dream of a life beyond survival. She imagined visiting other stations, seeing planets she had only known from stories, and one day returning to her home world not as a rejected exile, but as a mother with a child, strong and alive. Daniel shared similar thoughts, speaking of distant places he had traveled and what they might find together. Their visions were different, yet they aligned in hope and determination. In the quiet moments, Lyra would sometimes speak of her people, of the council that had exiled her. But the words no longer carried pain. They carried a simple understanding. She had survived, and she had found a new family. The judgment of her past no longer defined her. One night, as the station orbited quietly in the darkness of space, Lyra held the child close and spoke softly, "We are not alone. We have each other." Daniel sat beside her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. He nodded, a silent promise that they would face the future together. The child's breathing was steady, its small hand resting on Lyra's chest. It was a life born in exile, yet surrounded by care, trust, and love. It represented hope for what could be, even when the world had once seemed so harsh. Lyra knew that challenges would come. The station was old, supplies were limited, and the universe was vast and unpredictable. But she also knew something stronger than fear. She knew that together, they could face anything. Trust had grown into love, and survival had grown into life. With a final glance at the stars, Lyra whispered, "This is our beginning." Daniel looked out with her, and for a moment, the two of them shared the silence of space, filled not with loneliness but with possibility. The child stirred, as if affirming her words. The future was wide open, filled with choices and adventures yet to come. In the small station that had once been a prison, a new family had formed. The alien mother, the human companion, and the child born of hope had created a life that was stronger than exile, brighter than fear, and more enduring than solitude. They had survived. They had trusted. They had begun again.